Is woke culture really helping society, or is it pushing us toward a dangerous path? Jordan Peterson, one of the most outspoken critics of the movement, has strong opinions about its impact on free speech, personal responsibility, and the very way we view each other. Today, we're diving into Peterson's powerful argument against this growing trend and asking if the push for political correctness is worth the cost to our freedoms. Stay tuned to find out why Peterson believes woke might be the enemy of real progress. If you're tired of hearing the same old opinions and want to dive into real, unfiltered discussions, this is the place to be. Hit that like button if you agree, and don't forget to subscribe. Jordan Peterson, a Canadian clinical psychologist and professor, has become one of the most vocal and controversial critics of woke culture. His critiques are wide-ranging, covering everything from identity politics to free speech, but at the heart of his opposition is a deeply philosophical argument about the direction society is heading. To understand Peterson's perspective on woke culture, it's essential to dive into his key concerns: the imposition of ideological purity, the rise of identity politics, the suppression of free speech, and the undermining of individual responsibility. Peterson first garnered attention for his stance against Canada's Bill C-16, which added gender identity and gender expression to the list of prohibited grounds for discrimination under Canadian law. He argued that this bill would compel speech by forcing individuals to use specific gender pronouns or face legal consequences. His opposition wasn't born out of a desire to disrespect anyone's identity, but from a belief that it was a dangerous overreach by the state. Peterson sees this as a pivotal moment where the government attempts to legislate not just behavior, but thought itself. To him, this is a profound violation of the most basic freedoms: freedom of speech and thought. If we allow the state to dictate what we can and cannot say, he warns, we are on a slippery slope toward authoritarianism. But Peterson's critique extends far beyond just legal measures. He argues that woke culture and the broader social justice movements that support it are part of a dangerous trend toward what he calls ideological possession. In his view, woke culture is not simply a collection of beliefs about equality and social justice. It's become a rigid, dogmatic ideology that demands conformity and punishes dissent. Woke activists, Peterson claims, are less concerned with the actual issues they claim to fight for, and more interested in enforcing a set of ideological beliefs through social pressure. This is, for Peterson, a form of groupthink, a collective mindset that discourages independent thought and demands ideological purity. Woke culture's obsession with group identity is another major point of Peterson's criticism. He sees the focus on identity politics as not only divisive, but also profoundly reductive. Identity politics, which is based on the idea that people should be categorized and judged primarily by their race, gender, or sexual orientation, undermines the concept of individualism. Peterson believes that this approach encourages people to view themselves and others not as individuals with unique experiences, but as members of predetermined groups. This, he argues, is inherently dehumanizing. People become labeled and categorized based on traits they cannot change, and this leads to resentment and division rather than unity. In Peterson's view, one of the most destructive aspects of woke culture is its emphasis on victimhood. By constantly highlighting oppression and inequality, woke culture fosters a mindset in which individuals see themselves as powerless victims of systemic forces. Peterson argues that this robs people of their agency. It discourages personal responsibility and reinforces a sense of helplessness. He believes that true progress comes not from blaming external systems for one's problems, but from taking responsibility for one's own life and choices. By focusing on group-based grievances, woke culture, according to Peterson, encourages a victim mentality that undermines the very idea of personal agency. But perhaps the most critical element of Peterson's critique is his concern with the suppression of free speech. Peterson is deeply committed to the idea that society can only thrive if people are allowed to express their ideas no matter how controversial. In a world dominated by political correctness and cancel culture, Peterson believes that the fear of being labeled as problematic or offensive is stifling meaningful dialogue. He argues that the ability to freely express differing opinions, even uncomfortable ones, is essential for a healthy democracy. Woke culture, by silencing those who dissent, creates a culture of fear where people are afraid to speak their minds. For Peterson, this is a threat to intellectual freedom and the pursuit of truth. He often draws parallels between modern woke culture and totalitarian ideologies of the past. He sees the rise of social justice movements as a form of collectivism that is reminiscent of the ideological purity of regimes like Stalinist Russia or Maoist China. In these societies, dissent was not tolerated, and anyone who questioned the official narrative was silenced. Peterson fears that we are heading down a similar path, where people are pressured to conform to a set of beliefs or face social ostracism. The problem with this, according to Peterson, is that it leaves no room for debate, no space for nuance, and no tolerance for the complexity of human experience. Peterson's concerns about woke culture are not just theoretical. He believes that the consequences of this ideological shift are already visible in society. We see it in the rise of cancel culture, where people's careers and reputations can be destroyed over a single misstep, or in the increasing censorship on university campuses, where speakers with controversial viewpoints are often disinvited or shouted down. Peterson believes that this creates a dangerous environment where people are afraid to express their opinions and where dissent is no longer tolerated. Despite the intensity of his critique, Peterson's goal is not to condemn those who identify with social justice causes, but to encourage a more thoughtful and balanced approach. He argues that the pursuit of equality and justice is noble, but that it must be done in a way that respects individual rights, fosters open dialogue, and doesn't sacrifice the core principles of freedom and personal responsibility. Peterson encourages people to question the prevailing narrative, to think critically, and to resist the urge to conform to ideologies that demand unquestioning loyalty. In the end, Peterson's critique of woke culture is about more than just opposing a set of beliefs. It's about defending the values that have allowed societies to thrive: freedom of speech, individual responsibility, and intellectual diversity. Woke culture, according to Peterson, represents a step toward a society where people are no longer encouraged to think for themselves, but are instead forced to adhere to a narrow, dogmatic worldview. Peterson's message is a call to resist this trend, to stand up for free expression, and to remember that true progress comes from embracing complexity, diversity of thought, and the ability to have difficult conversations without fear of retribution. For Peterson, the battle is about much more than just ideas. It's about safeguarding the freedoms that make a democratic society possible. His critique of woke culture is a warning about the dangers of ideological conformity and the importance of defending individual rights in an increasingly polarized world. Whether or not you agree with him, his challenge to the status quo forces us to think deeply about the future we want to create and the kind of society we want to live in. As we wrap up this deep dive into Jordan Peterson's critique of woke culture, one thing is clear: the conversation is far from over. Peterson's warnings about ideological conformity, the suppression of free speech, and the rise of identity politics challenge us to think critically about the direction society is heading. Whether you agree or disagree with his views, these are discussions we can't afford to ignore. If you found this video thought-provoking, there's so much more to explore. We dive deep into important social issues, philosophy, and culture, always challenging the status quo and seeking to understand the world from new perspectives.